This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Although I'm a composer and pianist, first and foremost, I've also made a lot of my living reviewing recordings, primarily those of piano music, for various magazines and publications, most prominently for ClassicsToday.com and for Gramophone magazine. I also host the weekly piano radio program Between the Keys on the Classical Network and WWFM.org. And when I'm with my pianist friends and with colleagues and music lovers, they often will ask me just what I think about a certain pianist or a certain recording, or they want me to recommend a recording of a specific piece of music, or someone might say, hey, I want to get a collection with all of the Beethoven sonatas, or what cycle of Rachmaninoff concertos should I buy? Who did the best Chopin etudes? And so on and so forth. Which version should I look for? Sometimes these questions can be easy to answer, but then other times I have to really think about what I'm going to say before I answer, being put on the spot. And when it comes to the standard piano repertoire, there are so many choices because more and more pianists are recording the same works, and they continue to bring high standards of excellence to their recordings. Performing standards are higher than ever, and there are more excellent quality recordings available of classical music now than at any other time in history, I think. And it's so hard for me to keep up with the sheer amount of piano releases coming out, whether they are on CD or through download and streaming platforms. So the purpose of the Piano Maven podcast is to make recommendations. Sometimes I'll talk about a new release. Sometimes I will discuss an unfamiliar recording of a familiar work that, might deserve more attention than it gets. And you can say that about so many recordings. I'm just looking on my shelf at the many piano versions of Bach's Goldberg variations. I mean, that's a topic for many, many, many episodes, but we'll be getting to the Goldbergs pretty soon, I'm sure. Sometimes I will revisit an iconic recording that you should know about that perhaps has been out for many decades, yet somehow it doesn't get too much attention nowadays. Or I will devote an episode to a specific pianist or maybe a specific record label. I'm going to try to keep these podcasts relatively brief and to the point, at least for the time being. Although this first episode is going to be a little bit longer than usual because I'm going to be talking about the pianist Aldo Ciccolini, and I'm going to be making 10 recommendations, not necessarily his 10 best recordings, but 10 recordings that are typical of his artistry and I think represent the range of what he has done on record. Aldo Ciccolini lived from 1925 until 2015, and he was born in Naples, and he studied at that city's conservatory as a child. He first came to international attention in 1949 when he won the International Marguerite Long-Jacques Thibault competition in Paris. In addition to his long concert and recording career, Aldo Ciccolini taught at the Paris Conservatory from 1970 until 1988. He recorded prolifically from an early age. I think he started around 1950, and he kept going until his death. Although most music lovers associate Ciccolini with his groundbreaking recordings of the music of Eric Satie, as well as a lot of unknown, at least unknown as far as the piano repertoire, French repertoire. The truth is that Ciccolini really played almost everything, and his discography covers an amazingly eclectic scope of composers and styles. So for me to pick Aldo Ciccolini's 10 best recordings or 10 most representative recordings is kind of a challenge because, quite frankly, we are spoiled for choice. But I'm going to talk about 10 releases that I have enjoyed for years and years, and I keep coming back to these. And I think that these 10 releases all represent the essence of this marvelous pianist. What characterizes most of Ciccolini's recordings, especially his earlier ones, is crisp articulation and a kind of surface brilliance that is typical of the French school. And as Ciccolini got older, his style seemed to get broader and fuller bodied in terms of his sonority, and I would say even more emotionally generous, perhaps. A good place to start, I think, our first selection is going to be a 3-disc set on the Cascaval label that contained the complete lyric pieces of Edvard Grieg. And these are beautifully nuanced yet very direct performances. They're full of charm and deep feeling, and they also are beautifully engineered. So that's my first Ciccolini recommendation, the Grieg lyric pieces. My second recommendation is another recording that comes from late in Ciccolini's career. It appeared on the La Dolce Volta label, and it contains the big Fantasia and the sonata in C minor of Mozart, Kerschel numbers 475 and 457. And when Mozart wrote in one of his letters about how phrasing should flow like oil, I think he could have been describing Ciccolini's playing on this recording. And by the way, I think these performances are superior to those that Ciccolini made earlier in a complete Mozart sonata cycle for a label called Discovery. And this cycle has been long out of print, and it's not very easy to source. But this La Dolce Volta release is highly recommended. My third Ciccolini recommendation is the cycle of the 5 concertos by Camille Saint-Saëns that he recorded with Sergio Baudo conducting the Orchestre de Paris for the EMI label. And basically, this was the reference edition of choice if you wanted the Saint-Saëns concertos in stereo in the 1960s and early 70s. That was until they were replaced by EMI with those versions with pianist Jean-Philippe Collard and André Previn conducting. And since then, we've had Saint-Saëns cycles with better sound and better orchestral playing. But I have to say that the pointed wit and the slightly dry sound that characterizes Ciccolini's interpretations, I think really befits the music, and he truly taps into the composer's aesthetic both musically and pianistically. Recommendation number 4. Ciccolini made a disc of piano music by Rossini, and I think this is a really underrated and overlooked body of work. Rossini wrote tons and tons of piano music after his retirement from the opera stage. And these pieces are so delightfully melodic, but there are a lot of surprising harmonic twists and turns. And they often are very challenging to play. And I think that Ciccolini totally understands how to project Rossini's surface charm and his elegance, as well as his brashness. I think all these qualities really come together. So definitely consider Ciccolini's Rossini recital recorded for EMI in the early 1970s. My 5th recommendation is music of Brahms. You know, it's easy to think that a pianist who is so adept in the French repertoire could be totally at sea when playing Brahms, but that is absolutely not true about Aldo Ciccolini. I think his Brahms recordings have real clarity and transparency, plus a kind of melancholy lyricism that really works so well and is very reflected in this music. Ciccolini recorded all of Brahms' Klavierstück books, meaning the collections of piano pieces encompassing Opus 76, Opus 116, 117, 118, and 119. These were all recorded for the EMI label, and there was a time where you could get all of the Ciccolini Brahms recordings in a collection that also contained Ciccolini's Schumann. I don't know if this is still easy to source, but you certainly can find Ciccolini's EMI Brahms recordings in this huge box set that came out a few years ago with his complete EMI recordings on 56 CDs. I really don't know if it's in print anymore, but certainly in streaming platforms and via download, you can get these Brahms recordings. They are really worth hearing. And my sixth recommendation is music of Franz Liszt. Ciccolini recorded a lot of Liszt, by the way, but one release that has always stood out to me is a 1970 recording that contained the Funerai, the Venezia e Napoli, and the two St. Francis legends. And I love the performances of the legends especially. I think I once described them as big, colorful canvases painted in broad brush strokes. At least that's what I thought of Ciccolini's interpretation. Very, very different from the equally wonderful but quite different Wilhelm Kempff recordings from around 1950, which I likened to subtle pastels rather than big, big oils. I heard Ciccolini play the legends in a recital many years ago, and I will never forget how his sound just filled the room. Now, here's a little sidebar. Ciccolini recorded Liszt's Harmonie poétique et religieuse on two occasions for EMI, both in 1968 and in 1990. But there is a live performance of this cycle from 2003 that has been circulating in the piano world. I think it comes from a broadcast. I'm not 100% certain. You can find it on YouTube. And my late friend Joe Patridge was the one who turned me on to this. He said, you really have to hear this cycle. This is some of Ciccolini's best playing. And I agree. If you can find these recordings, they're not commercially published, but they are so worth hearing. I mean, this is really Ciccolini at his best. But those two legends with Ciccolini and Liszt, absolutely fantastic. Okay, recommendation number 7. Ciccolini championed a lot of French music far and beyond the Impressionists, and he made a 3-disc survey of the piano music of Déodat de Séverac, and this was a composer who primarily wrote character pieces for piano, and they have a lot of wit and charm, but there also are darker undercurrents. And Ciccolini pretty much pioneered this repertoire on disc, and his de Séverac cycle, I think, still remains a point of reference. My 8th recommendation is a Scarlatti recital that was on EMI, and I really love Ciccolini's way with Scarlatti. It's highly articulated, slightly dry, and I think it's kind of the musical equivalent of Prosecco, if you know what I mean. For my 9th recommendation, I'm going to turn to music of Chopin. Now, Ciccolini did not record an awful lot of Chopin, kind of surprisingly, given that he recorded, almost every other composer in existence. But I think that his 1970s recordings of the Chopin waltzes have marvelous virtuosity and elan, and even a little bit of edge to the surface charm. And they complement the more robust and lyrical Arthur Rubinstein Chopin waltzes cycle, the one they did in stereo. So if you're looking for a recording of the Chopin waltzes, you certainly won't be disappointed with Ciccolini. However, for my 10th Aldo Ciccolini recommendation, and I know that you knew this was coming. We cannot discuss this pianist without talking about his pioneering work on behalf of the music of Erik Satie. He recorded all of Satie's piano music for the EMI label in the 1960s and early 1970s. And there was a big Satie boom in the late 60s, probably because the composer being a kind of outlier and rebel, and his determination to do his own thing and to buck the establishment resonated with the 1960s zeitgeist. Now, Ciccolini re-recorded the Erik Satie piano music cycle in the early 80s, also for EMI. I prefer some interpretations in the later cycle, but I find that the later cycle is not recorded to my taste because the piano sounds a little brittle and glassy, which was kind of typical of early digital productions of piano recordings that EMI was making in France. Whereas his earlier cycle, I think, has much warmer sonics and it's a little easier on the ear in that regard. So that's the one that I recommend. So I hope that these 10 recommendations will give you a good place to start if you are new to Aldo Ciccolini's artistry, and there's a lot of wonderful and rewarding listening ahead for you. This is Jed Disler. I look forward to being with you next time on the Piano Maven podcast. Take care.